Welcome to part 29 in this series of videos on creating a simple purchase order system using Blazor and C#. This application is probably proof that a software project is never finished. There's always another bug to fix, improvement to be carried out, or if one is brave, a review and revision of code. In this video, we will provide a default tax code and tax rate for an order line, and in the process move some configuration data from appsettings.json to a table that can be maintained by the user. We'll introduce the use of the switch statement in place of if, and trap a flaw that currently allows a user to attempt to email an order to a supplier with a blank email address. One of the comments in one of the videos, I think it was part 15, editing and deleting order lines, alighted on the fact that when an order is added, the first order line is not provided with a default tax code. In fact, the tax code is specifically set to 0, as we can see in this line here. The suggestion was made that to get around this behavior, that the PO line tax ID should be set to 1. However, that didn't really get around the problem because simply setting the tax ID to 1 didn't populate the tax rate. So it also needed the second line setting the tax rate to decimal 0.2. Now, whilst applauding the commenter's observation and understanding of the problem, I think there are two problems here. The first is that I think setting values like this in code is too restricting. The end user has no control over the default tax code. It's set by the programmer. Secondly, I think it's also potentially dangerous. Suppose that the tax rate changes to, say, 25%. An admin user who has access to the tax rate table would quite rightly go to the tax rate form and change the tax rate percentage, expecting it to change the rate for new order lines. But it wouldn't. The first line would still be 20%. The problem here is that when the tax rate changes occur, the C# code would also need changing and a new release of the software required. We can get around the second problem by reading the tax rate from the tax rate table when initializing the order, and we'll come to that. But the first part of the problem got me thinking. My initial reaction was that we could put the default tax ID in appsettings.json, but on reflection, that's just as inaccessible to the user as the C# code. It also occurred to me that much of the configuration data that we record in appsettings.json also falls into this category. I think some of these settings would be better placed in a SQL table and a user form provided to allow easy changes when required. The data I think we should move from app settings to a control table is shown here. So it's the SMTP email information stuff, the send grid, API key and email and friendly name. But in addition, I think we want to add the default tax ID. And while we're about it, I'm also going to add another item called email send method. This will allow the user to choose between SMTP or SendGrid. We could also add further information such as company name and address that could be used on the email purchase order. But for the time being, I will resist this temptation. And I'm also going to resist the temptation to change the names of some of these variables. For example, I'm very tempted to change SMTP pass to SMTP password, but that's for another time. So the first thing to do is to create the new table called control table. And I've got a SQL script that will do this for us. This is the script. And as you can see, it's got an ID and then those various additional columns that I suggested. And we're going to insert one record because this table will only ever have one record, or at least we hope it will only ever have one record. And so I'm going to populate it with some default data, basically just to get us going. So if I run the script, it's created the table. If I refresh, and we look at the data, you can see I've just got one record. It's got ID number 1 and the default data in there. So I'll close that. At this stage, we would use the code generator created by Alan Simpson to create the stored procedures and the C# code for using Dapper, such as the model class, the service, and interface. But with one major modification. The control table only ever has one record, and it should always have ID equals 1. However, to guard against this ever getting set to something other than 1, I've changed the stored procedure for get1 so that it gets the top 1. So let's have a look at that script here. So this is the SQL script to create the stored procedures we need, and we only need 2. We need this one called get1, and as you can see, it's going to select top 1 from the table, and then we've got the update. We don't need any others to add or delete records. So I'm just going to run that script to add those stored procedures. And now we can turn our attention to C#. So the first thing we're going to need to do is create a model for the control table. So in data, we want to right click, add a new class, and we're going to call it control table. And to save time, I'm going to delete all that and bring in some code I've already got. And this is all fairly standard stuff. I'm using data annotations, and I've put in some checks here for things like the email address, which is going to ensure it is in the format of an email address, for SMTP email address, and so on and so forth. So that's fairly standard stuff. Then we need a service for the control table. So again, I'm going to right click, I should say that I'm going to just copy and paste information in here or the code into here, but I've taken the shortcut. It would actually be created by Alan Simpson's code. So have a look at that video. I think it's quite near the beginning of the series on how to create, use the Alan Simpson's code generator. So here, we've got the control table service, and we're just missing the control table service interface. So as you can see, we've got a public async task, just get1, and that just runs the get1 stored procedure. There are no parameters passed to it. And we've got the update table where we're passing all the various variables or fields to that. So let's add the interface. Get rid of the template, and so in the interface, we've just got simply the get one and the control table update, where I'm passing in the whole control table object. So I'll save those as we go. And lastly, because we've added this, we need to make a change to startup. To add the service. And I'll save that. So we've got the control table, we've got the model, the service, and the interface, and we've got the SQL, and we've actually got one record in there. But we'd need a new page or raise a page to maintain it. So under pages, I'm going to add a new one. And it's a razor component. And I'm going to call it control table page. And the code for this is here. So there are several things that we need to note about this. First of all, when we initialize the page, it's going to get the control table get one, so it's going to get our one and only control table record. And the tax rate is going to provide a list of tax rates from the tax service. So we've got a list of email methods, and this is going to populate the drop-down list for the tax, the drop-down list for the default email method, and the tax rate here is going to provide the list of tax rates for the so the user can select a default tax rate. So at the top, we've got a heading saying control table. Then we've got a section called email settings, which is going to consist of a text box and a numeric text box for the SMTP host and SMT port number. Then another flex container for the email friendly name and the actual email address and the password. And note here on the password, I'm using type input type dot password, and that will obscure any data entered in there. Then we've got the SendGrid email settings. So we've got the SendGrid API key, which again is obscured by making it a password type, and the SendGrid email friendly name and SendGrid email address. And here we have the email method, which is a drop-down list, and that will be populated from these items down here. So either SMTP or SendGrid. And then we've got a default tax rate, again, a drop-down list. These are all Syncfusion items or controls, by the way, which is going to show the default tax description and ID. So I think at that stage we should be able to run it. Apart from one thing I always forget, and that is we also need to make a change to the nav menu, which is in the shared folder. And I think what we'll do is move tax from there to here, and then add in an item for the control table. Right, now let's see if that runs. So let's have a look at the control table. That's what it should look like. So we've basically got settings up here for SMTP email. So we've got the host, the port number, the friendly name of this person, the actual name and their password. Alternatively, or as well, we've got the send grid information. We've got the select method here, which is a drop down. So I can select SMTP or send grid. And we've got a default tax rate. The user can now select the default tax rate. I'm going to leave it at that. So we can save that. So that's working fine. So the next stage is to add the default tax rate to the purchase order page. So if I briefly add an order now, doesn't matter who I choose. If I select add, you'll see that the tax rate is blank. The tax rate is blank and the percentage for the tax rate is blank. And that's what we're going to change. So I'll stop that and go back to the code. So let's close these. And we want the purchase order page. Now, there are quite a few changes in here. And again, in the interest of time, I'm going to remove all this and just drop in some new code. So the first thing we've done is to inject the control table service because we're going to be reading data for the default tax code from there. The next thing we've done, I'm not going to change anything in the actual form of the dialogues or indeed the style. But the first thing we've got to do is define or declare some variables. So I've declared control table and a default ID and a default tax rate. And then on the page initialize, I'm populating control table with our get one and only record. The default tax ID I can get straight away from that table, so it's the default tax ID, whatever that is, as maintained by the user. But the default tax rate has to be a kind of lookup to the tax rate table. And now we've already got the tax rates here. So we're able to use this default tax rate equals decimal tax, the tax object, first a default. Now this is effectively saying where the tax ID is the same as this default tax ID that's just been read, and we want the tax rate. So that effectively does most of the hard work. But the next section is when we select add for the item, when we add a new order line, we're now going to have add edit order line PO line tax ID is the default tax ID that we've just populated, and we're actually going to populate the add edit order line PO line tax rate with the default tax rate that we've just added. So I think that should now also work. So let's save that and run it. And if I try adding a new order now, you'll see that even before I've selected a product, the tax rate is here, and the tax rate description, and the actual percentage is saved here. So that's pretty straightforward. And just to kind of demonstrate that one stage further, if I change the default tax rate to, let's say, the exceedingly high rate, add a new order, you'll see that now we've got exceedingly high rate and the percentage associated with that. So the default tax rate is now entirely under the user's control. They don't need to call on the program and say, tax rates changed, could you issue us with a new program? So that covers the first part, and that covers the query that was commented on by the YouTube viewer. But I've kind of mucked things up by moving all the SMTP and SendGrid stuff to that control table as well. So we'll need to do something to change all that. So that's basically controlled in the data. In the email sender kit, email sender mail kit, previously we were getting this from the app settings.json, and we were going to pass to it the subject and the body. Well, we're now going to be sending to it all the SMTP data that we need, and we aren't going to need this section here. And this is going to be obtained in a different way as well, i.e. as passed to it. So in the interest of time, I'm going to delete all that. And this is the mail kit code. So we've removed that information about the configuration, and we're passing into the method or function all the variables that we need for the email, and just including those straight into the email sending method. So that's basically fairly straightforward. And we've got the similar thing to do on the sender for the send grid. So we're not passing in any of that. So we can get rid of that. And this is all going to be different. It's going to have all the information, and we aren't going to be selecting these using the configuration. So let me delete all that and bring in the revised version. As I say, it is slightly simpler, apart from the fact that we're passing in all the parameters rather than trying to get them from the configuration. That does, of course, mean that we need to get those parameters or variables from the index page. So let's have a look at the index page. I'll save all this as I go along. So not quite significant, but there are a few changes here. So again, I'm going to delete everything and replace it and highlight the differences. So first of all, we've got the inject control table service. Then let's minimize this. And I've then declared the new variables that we'll need. So the control table, then the strings and integers for SMTP host, etc., i.e. those additional columns that we added to the control table. So we declare those, and then when we initialize the page, we get the control table, get one record, and then we populate those variables we've declared with the data from the control table. So that gives us the information that we need there. Then on the toolbar click handler for email, Right, here we are. I couldn't see it for a moment. I've declared a Boolean saying email sent, and I've set that to false. And this is where I decided I'd use something different. I'd normally, or previously, I've used if statements here, but I decided that the switch statement was probably better suited to this, where we've got a number of options. So email send method, which it's reading from the control table, will either be SMTP or SendGrid. It should never be anything else. So if it's SMTP, it'll say email sent, which is this Boolean, and it'll then pass into the email service for MailKit the variables that it needs, which will then either return true or false. So if I look back at the the MailKit, you'll see it's a Boolean. So either it goes and comes back as successful, or so it'll return true if it's successful, or false if it isn't. And then here, if it's email sent is true, then it'll then raise a component called toast. It'll say email sent successfully. If not, it'll say failure. So if the email sender method is SendGrid, it will use this method instead, exactly the same kind of principle. Or in the what I think it would be almost impossible situation, I've provided a default here which would say warning, no email method has been set up in the control table. So if that situation ever does arise, that is again within the control of the user or an admin user who's able to go into the control table and add the missing bit of information. So that should then work successfully for sending an email. It was while I was doing this that I realized, or when I was testing this, that I realized it was possible to have a situation where there was no email address on a purchase order. And if the user tried to send an email where there was no email address, we ran into difficulties. So what I've done is just simply introduced another test at the top of the email toolbar click handler. So the first thing is I'm checking that an order has been selected. That's as was done before, but what I had previously was if and then an else. What I've decided to do here is just put a series of if statements, and if it hits one problem, it gives the user a warning, and then it just returns. So it comes out of this, and you're basically set back to square one. So the first thing is it checks to make sure there's an order. If there is an order, it checks to see if the supply email is either null or an empty string. And if it does, it gives a warning to say that the supply email address is missing. If that's found, the system kind of returns here, so you're back to square one. Otherwise, it goes ahead and sends the email. So that should all work successfully. There's one last thing to do, and that is that we've got some lines in appsettings.json that we don't need, so those can be deleted. They're basically I'm not going to show what I've actually got in app settings at the moment, but you can delete all those rows that have got SMTP or SendGrid information in them, just to clear up. So in conclusion, I'd just like to say that the introduction of the control table seems to have been a lot of hard work and for seemingly little gain. However, I'm sure this has been the right decision. If something like a tax rate, email address, or password changes, it is much simpler for the user to update a control table rather than have a programmer changing appsettings.json. There are also probably lots of places in my code where I could simplify the code by replacing if statements with switch statements, or with a separate if statement in place of else if. I haven't been through this exercise, but feel I probably should. With these various changes in place, we'll just run the project again. And I'll now add a new record. I think it's Kelly's Motor Parts. Yes, notice that Kelly's hasn't got an email address. So I'll now add a product, and notice that the tax rate description is shown and the tax rate percentage. I'll just add one product. Save that. And now if I try to email, first of all it says please select an order from the grid. If I select Kelly's Motor Parts and try emailing that, I get supply email addresses missing. So I think that probably covers it for this video. Thank you very much for watching. I'll put a link in the description to the accompanying web page and the code page with all the changes that have been made in this particular video. Thank you very much for watching. I do appreciate it. I'm not sure, this might be the last video in this series. I can always go on improving and changing and amending things, but I think I've probably covered the ground I wanted to cover for this particular series of videos. But I intend to think of another project, so do watch out. There'll be more videos coming along. Thank you very much indeed.